Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Halcyon Razor Review. I'm your host, Lauren Risley. On this episode, I'm going to be taking a look at a game series that had such promise, but ultimately I fear under-delivered on that promise. The Force Unleashed series. The original concept behind The Force Unleashed was, quote-unquote, kicking ass with the Force. That's what the LucasArts designs team, whenever they sat down to discuss ideas and concepts and come up with ideas for the game, they would announce that as kind of like a ritualistic thing of saying that before every single meeting in order to get them G'd up and ready for producing the game. The series tries to fill in some of the gaps between episodes 3 and 4 and tries to give a more over-the-top experience to its gameplay audience by enhancing the abilities of the Force to almost preposterous levels and giving a character that's new to the canon, an individual by the name of Galen Merrick, or as he'd later become known as Starkiller. The premise of the game, though, is kind of secondary to the experience of the player. This game lets you go ape shit with the Force. You can use it for endless abilities for poops and giggles and is as close to an arcade game as it's possible to get in the Star Wars franchise without going into the KOTOR side of gaming whereby you'll lose days of your life just trying to explore the lore of it. So on this occasion, on this review, I'm going to be looking at both games in perspective to see where they ultimately delivered and where they ultimately failed. So for your viewing enjoyment, please enjoy the Halcyon Razor review of the Force Unleashed series.
A son?
Run! Lord Vader.
Come with me. More will be here soon.
So, to kick things off, let's take a look at the core element of this game, its gameplay. In both installments, you'll be taking control of Starkiller as he traverses throughout the various linear missions to complete objectives such as killing bosses, assassinating Jedi, destroying infrastructure, and performing an insane display of force power such as pulling a Star Destroyer out of orbit, chaining and throwing lightning from the sky, or using a combination of all to take down major characters from the Star Wars mythos. The main bulk of the game is centered around a fairly standard hack and slash mechanic, with Starkiller's lightsabers able to cut through a variety of different in-game objects such as stormtroopers and various other destructibles, but otherwise function as the standard hit and damage swords you see in most hack and slashers games. The difference, however, is in the use of force powers. They are so epic. They're often over-exaggerated and more aesthetically vibrant versions of the power seen in the films and television shows, and are used to devastating effect. Need to get through a blast door? Why look for a button when you can simply blast your way through with a barrage of force pushes? Need to turn on a generator? Why look for a power source when you could blast it with a barrage of force lightning? These powers can be upgraded to become more powerful, wider in scope, and more pronounced in their effect, with additional powers such as the saber throw, the mind trick, and force repulse powers, all having certain in-game uses, but all of which provide tons of fun in applying them to combat situations. But without doubt the most fun I had with any of the powers was with telekinesis, but also combining it with the environmental issues and other powers to devastating effect. Toying with my enemies while they floated helplessly in the air was some sadistic fun that I don't like admitting is necessarily there. For instance, you can use your telekinesis to catch full-speed TIE fighters, crushing them and then using the remnants of the ship to crush a squadron of stormtroopers, before grabbing any survivors into the air and blasting them with force lightning, finally finishing off with one last force push into the vast expanse of the blast shaft or endless seas of Camino that awaits them. It is a sadistic and hedonistic pleasure, but a pleasure nonetheless, and will provide you with hours of fun as long as you remember to have fun with the mechanics of the game. However, it has to be said that despite all the powers and the admitted variety of enemy types, as well as the addition of boss level enemies to punctuate each level, the game can feel very repetitive and arcade-like, with not a lot in the way of additional activities or distractions in any way from the many campaign missions. And this, coupled with the short length of, say, the second game, can leave both feeling slightly underwhelming in terms of an overall experience. It seems akin to Prototype in that sense, both having an excellent concept that just seems to have been executed with minimum amounts of effort despite the overwhelming potential in their gameplay options. Enemies range from standard stormtroopers, rancors, Imperial Guards, and a Gorog to epic boss battles against the likes of Darth Maul, Darth Vader, and even the Emperor himself, all of which feel somehow similar given the method of attack remains broadly the same. Wait for your window to attack, and then mash them buttons to win. The controls are so easy to pick up and play, and the enemies are numerous. It can be tricky, but ultimately are all flawed and have certain weaknesses and patterns to attack you can exploit if you choose not to simply unleash all of your power on them, which is super easy to do. Overall, the game is great to play in bursts, but anything over an hour or a level is usually a waste of time as its inherent flaws will become more and more apparent to you, and the bosses don't help as they only serve to undermine this point. However, while we're touching that in the next section, I will end with, if you're looking for a new take on a Star Wars game in terms of gameplay, without going as deep as something like, say, Jedi Knight or Jedi Academy, then this might well be worth taking a look at in terms of a new gameplay experience. Okay, now with gameplay aside, and our fingers mashed solely into the controller, let's look at the secondary element of this game, its presentation and design. The game's graphics and soundtrack are impressive in some respects and slightly underdeveloped in others. For instance, the main theme song is epic, beautiful, and somehow keeps with the tones and overtures made famous in John Williams' scores from the movies, but with a new, darker, more frantic feel to it. However, the rest of the soundtrack seems to be slightly under par or non-existent, especially in the second installment. The graphics seem to be, again, very erratic in the second game in particular, switching from an in-game engine generated to pre-rendered cutscenes, whereas in the first game it relied more heavily on pre-rendered scenes, which, in my opinion, were cleaner and better looking and more aesthetically pleasing. Despite the equivalent cutscenes in the second game looking slightly better, the only exception to this being Starkiller himself. Somehow in the first game he looks more human and realistic in his mannerisms and movement, as well as better lip syncing. However, in the second game, it looks as though the people animating his mouth were not even in the same galaxy as those animating the backgrounds and character models. Especially when you compare both to the promotional material. Both games are letdowns graphically in terms of scope, with the linear levels not doing much to immerse the player in its world. However, the destruction is very impressive. The way the wood splinters and tears away, the way the metal bends and contorts and snaps based on the amount of power you blast through it. It can't be denied that in this aspect of the game, it shines. The menus in the interface are easy enough to navigate, and with the game having multiple difficulty levels as well as Game Plus modes to allow players to play through in effectively God mode, the game does have a surprising amount of heavy replay value. Considering all I've mentioned above, meaning this is a good game series to have in your collection, especially if you're like me and you have that hankering for unlimited power from time to time. Overall, the game is where it needs to be in terms of its presentation, but nothing mind-blowing.
So, the gameplay is epic and enjoyable, the presentation is well-rounded and good for its time. So where did it all go wrong? Well, that would be the thing that sort of lets most LucasArts sequels down, its story.
The team at LucasArts made a concerted effort to make the series feel part of the Star Wars mythos in a way that they made some games not feel so much. Even Knights of the Old Republic has moments where it can feel alien to its mainstream counterparts, in terms of its relatively low production budget and objectively poor presentation. And as a result, the inclusion of many of the original trilogy's characters helps to anchor Starkiller and his story to the tale we are all already familiar with. Set before the events of Episode 4 and presumably in retrospect, before the events of Rogue One, the story follows the events of a young boy named Galen Merrick, discovered by Darth Vader during an attack on Kashyyyk. Vader decides to train the boy in secret to use the dark side of the Force as his apprentice, under the pretense of one day overthrowing the Emperor. Codenamed Starkiller, the boy becomes a prodigy in the Force, and goes on a journey of self-discovery to fulfill his destiny while uncovering his past and shaping the future events of the galaxy itself. The story is suitably melodramatic, epic, but personal in places. His fractious relationship with Vader, his bond with his personal droid Proxy, and his burgeoning master-student relationship with Jedi Master Ram Kota all lend themselves well to the narrative and help make his story feel deep and impactful. However, I'd say that the only weakness is that of the love interest, Juno Eclipse, who would have perhaps been better suited to the position Rey held in Episode 7 of a strong but mysterious female support character who forges her own path rather than succumbs to the tried and tired narrative of love conquering all, which the story ultimately devolves into. In many ways it suffers from the same problem as Star Wars Battlefront 2, in the sense that while the main character often has interactions with the main trilogy's characters, it can sometimes feel somewhat cheap and coincidental, but the difference being is that he is part of the main canon from the get-go in terms of his interaction with Vader, and therefore legitimizes him, as opposed to Iden Versio, who is somehow wedged in these events in a way that Starkiller doesn't share. It can mean it feels cheap at times, I will concede that, but at other times he feels right at home in the mythos. Overall, the story is good in spots, but it can be slightly predictable at times. The main elements where it exceeds expectations are those when Starkiller interacts with the main cast in meaningful ways, and when he displays the kind of limitless potential that entices you to see just how powerful he is, and how powerful he could become, and what kind of symbol he could become in terms of the franchise as a whole.
So moving on to a verdict for this game, it's tricky, because they both really suffer from the same flaws, but the thing is, the second one was rushed out so quickly and was given such little respect by its production company that I fear that the promise that it was given originally was curtailed, in large part due to just how short and unfulfilling that second story was, even if it had an ending that was pretty epic either way. It's hard to make a recommendation for a non-Star Wars fan, because to be honest, for a Star Wars fan, it's worth playing these two games just for the idea that they actually occurred and they contributed to the canon, because there's so many tiny little Easter eggs, so much filler that actually makes sense and gives some clarity on the situation when it led up to Episode 4. But now we have Rogue One for that, so we don't really need this game to give us that kind of satiation, if that is even a word. If not, hey, Halcyon Show just made up a new word, how cool is that? So I'm going to make a verdict based on my interpretation of the game as it was rather than it is now. I would say that these games are excellent arcade games. They're easily worth a 7, maybe pushing to an 8 out of 10 if you want a gaming experience for an hour, maybe more, for, you know, sort of 10 to 15 nights, just having your god complex absolutely satiated with the use of the Force being a unique gadget that something like the Wii and the Xbox Kinect ultimately delivered on. But I say this game delivered, which is that feeling of having the Force at your disposal and being able to use it on a whim, as opposed to other games where you could use the Force to a certain extent, but they felt very limited. However, if you're not into that kind of game and you're looking for a more deep, immersive experience, this will really not do it for you. In that situation, it's more like a 5. And I'm being generous with that because, like I said, the second game did so much to undermine its progress from the first and giving a believable and engrossing character that it really does hold itself back at times. It's really difficult to recommend to somebody because you know that if they're looking for a great story, they're not going to find it. So on this instance, it is kind of a double-edged sword. The gameplay does save it from being a complete train wreck of an idea, and the first game is definitely worth playing over the second because the second one just doesn't have the same feel and it just lacks that bit of gravitas. So if you want a great arcade Star Wars experience, pick up the first Force Unleashed. Super cheap, and it's probably available on a HD collection somewhere, if not now, in the future. The second one, though, I would recommend to only play if you're looking for a challenge, because the difficulty spikes in the second game are much worse than the first. So if that's really what you're after, if you're after some kind of Force-induced sadomasochistic experience, then go at it. In the meantime, though, thank you very much for watching this episode of the Halcyon Razor Review. As always, I'd like to say thank you to anyone who subscribed or liked or shared recently. I'd like to throw out some thanks to other channels that have been supporting me recently, whose promos you'll be seeing in these videos if you haven't done already. So be prepared for those, and please do go check them out. They are worthy of your acceptance, and they're worthy of a view at the very, very least. So I'd really appreciate if you could do that for me. So thanks very much for watching again. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you guys on the next episode of the Halcyon Razor Review.